Lieutenant Commander John Crommelin is standing in a shower 2 decks below the flight deck of the escort carrier USS Liscome Bay. He is 41 years old. He is the Chief of Staff to the Admiral commanding this task group. He never hears the torpedo hit. In 30 seconds, he will be blown out of that shower, naked, burned and alive, through a hole where the ship's hull used to be. What he feels is the deck under his feet disappear. What he sees in the half-second before the shockwave takes him is the entire aft third of his ship turning white so bright that sailors on the battleship New Mexico, 1,500 meters away, will later say the ocean itself seemed to catch fire. Inside 23 minutes, Liscome's gone. More than 600 men are dead. Among them, Rear Admiral Henry Mullinix, Captain Irving Wiltsey, and Doris Miller, the same Doris Miller who 2 years earlier had manned an anti-aircraft gun at Pearl Harbor and become the first black American to receive the Navy Cross. Liscome Bay is the 5th United States aircraft carrier lost in this war. Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp, Hornet, and now her. 6 more will follow. 11 American carriers, more than 3,000 sailors who never came home, and a set of institutional failures the U.S. Navy would spend the next 50 years trying not to talk about. This is the story of every one of them. But to understand how the world's most powerful navy lost 11 of these ships, we have to go back, not to Liscome Bay, to a morning 18 months earlier in a place called the Coral Sea. The morning of December 7th, 1941, changed the arithmetic of war in a single hour. Before that Sunday, the United States Navy counted 7 fleet aircraft carriers in its inventory: Lexington, Saratoga, Ranger, Yorktown, Enterprise, Wasp, Hornet. 7 ships, 7 flight decks, 7 floating airfields that together represented the entire American ability to project air power across an ocean that covered a third of the planet. Before Pearl Harbor, most senior officers in the Navy did not consider these ships to be the centerpiece of anything. The centerpiece was the battleship. The battleship was the queen. The battleship was what a fleet was built around. Aircraft carriers were useful. Aircraft carriers were interesting. But aircraft carriers were, in the words of one senior admiral writing in 1939, auxiliaries, support units, scouts, nice to have. Then the Japanese bombers came out of the clouds at Pearl Harbor, and by 9 in the morning, the American battleship fleet in the Pacific was burning at anchor. Every one of the 7 carriers was somewhere else that day. Every one of them survived. By nightfall on December 7th, the United States Navy no longer had a choice about what its centerpiece would be. The carriers were now the fleet, and within 11 months, 4 of them would be dead. Before we go further, one clarification. If you look up American aircraft carrier losses, you will sometimes see a ship called USS Langley CV-1 listed among the dead. Langley was the first aircraft carrier the United States ever commissioned. She was sunk south of Java in February of 1942. She was hit by Japanese dive bombers. Her crew abandoned her, and American destroyers scuttled her with torpedoes and gunfire. We are not counting her. The reason is simple. By 1937, Langley had been converted into a seaplane tender. Her flight deck had been partially cut away. She could not launch or recover carrier aircraft. When the Japanese found her in February 42, she was carrying disassembled P-40 fighters as cargo. She died as a transport, not as a carrier. 11 ships is the number we are counting. 11 American aircraft carriers, used as carriers, sunk or scuttled in combat between December 1941 and September 1945. 4 of them died in the first 11 months. The first was Lexington, CV-2, 27,000 tons, commissioned in 1927, converted from an unfinished battle cruiser hull, 270 meters long. Her nickname in the fleet was Lady Lex, and her captain in the first week of May 1942 was Frederick Carl Sherman. Sherman was 53 years old. He was a career naval aviator, Annapolis class of 1910, and he had commanded Lexington since June of the previous year. Above him in the chain of command was Rear Admiral Aubrey Ray Fitch, 58, commanding Task Force 11 from Lexington's Flag Bridge. Both men were flying their flags on a ship that neither of them had built and neither of them fully trusted, because Lexington was old and Lexington had a problem. The problem was gasoline. Aircraft carriers carry aviation gasoline the way tankers carry oil. Thousands of gallons of it stored in tanks deep in the ship's hull, pumped up through pipes to the flight deck to fuel the planes. The gasoline itself was not the problem. The problem was the vapor. Aviation gasoline gives off fumes. Fumes settle in enclosed spaces. And enclosed spaces on a warship are full of electrical equipment and hot metal and things that make sparks. The pre-war designers of Lexington had known this. They had installed a ventilation system to disperse the fumes. They believed it was adequate. It was not. On the morning of May 8, 1942, in the Coral Sea, Lexington was operating alongside her sister Yorktown against a Japanese carrier force built around Shokoku and Zuikoku. The two American carriers had already helped sink the light carrier Shoho the day before. Now the Japanese were coming for them. At 11:20 in the morning, Japanese torpedo bombers and dive bombers found Lexington. 2 torpedoes struck her port side. 2 bombs hit her flight deck. She caught fire in 3 places. She took on a 7-degree list, and then her damage control teams did something remarkable. They put out the fires. They shifted fuel to correct the list. They restored her to a full working state. By 12:30, Lexington was steaming at 25 knots. Her flight deck was operational. She was landing her own returning aircraft. Sherman walked the bridge and told his officers, in words that were repeated up and down the ship, that the old lady was going to be all right. At 12:47, the old lady exploded from the inside. The vibration from the torpedo hits had cracked internal fuel lines. Aviation gasoline vapor had been leaking, unseen and unsmelled, into a sealed compartment near a running generator. The vapor found the spark. The explosion killed the crew of the internal communications room instantly. It killed men throughout the forward section of the ship. It ruptured Lexington's fire main. It knocked out her damage control communications. It set off a fire that her crews could no longer reach. At 14:42, a second internal explosion followed, then a third. The fires spread to the aviation fuel storage itself. The temperature inside the hangar deck rose beyond what any human crew could survive to fight. At 17:07, Sherman gave the order to abandon ship. He was the last man off. He walked the length of Lexington's flight deck as her forward end was already sagging into the sea, and he lowered himself over the stern on a knotted line into the water where destroyers were waiting. At 19:52, the destroyer USS Phelps fired 5 torpedoes into what was left of Lexington. She rolled over and sank at 19:56. 216 men were dead. The ship's total complement had been 2,735. The Japanese had not sunk Lexington. Lexington's own fuel system had sunk Lexington. A design flaw the US Navy had accepted for 15 years, in a ship built before anyone knew what a carrier war would look like, had killed 216 Americans in a single afternoon. It was the first lesson. It would not be the last. The second lesson came 30 days later, at a place called Midway. Yorktown was CV-5. She was newer than Lexington, smaller, and built specifically as an aircraft carrier from the keel up. Her captain was Elliot Buckmaster, 53 years old, another Annapolis graduate, a quiet Kentuckian who ran his ship with a light hand. Above Buckmaster was Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, 57, commanding Task Force 17. Yorktown was not supposed to be at Midway. At Coral Sea 4 weeks earlier, she had taken a Japanese bomb through her flight deck. The bomb had exploded 4 decks down. It had killed dozens of men. including Lieutenant Milton Ernest Ricketts, 29 years old, the officer in charge of an engineer repair party who continued to fight the fires around him after being mortally wounded, and who would be awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously for what he did in the minutes before he died. The bomb had ruptured plating below the waterline. It had left Yorktown leaking a trail of oil that Japanese scout planes could have followed from 100 miles away. When she limped into Pearl Harbor on May 27th, the shipyard engineers who inspected her wrote up an estimate. 90 days of repair work, 3 months in dry dock. Yorktown would sit out the next battle. Admiral Chester Nimitz read the estimate, walked into the dry dock himself in white uniform trousers, and told the yard superintendent that Yorktown would sail in 72 hours. She sailed in 72 hours. Civilian welders worked through 3 nights without stopping. They patched the flight deck with steel plating that in some places was not fully cured when Yorktown left port. They rewired her damaged compartments. They pumped out her flooded voids. When she cleared the harbor on May 30th, some of those same civilian welders were still on board, riding her toward a battle none of them had signed up for because the work was not finished. On the morning of June 4th, Yorktown's dive bombers flying alongside those from Enterprise found and destroyed 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers at Midway, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. In 6 minutes, the 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, was still afloat, and Hiryu sent everything she had left at Yorktown. Yorktown took 3 bombs. Shortly after noon, she was set on fire. Her flight deck was punched open. She lost power. Her damage control teams, the same men who had done the impossible at Coral Sea, went to work again. Within 2 hours, the flight deck was patched. The fires were out. Yorktown was steaming under her own power at 19 knots. Then Hiryu's second wave arrived. 2 torpedoes hit Yorktown on the port side. Her steering jammed. She began to list heavily. Buckmaster, believing his ship was going to capsize with hundreds of men still trapped below, gave the order to abandon her. But Yorktown did not capsize. She sat listing in the open Pacific and refused to sink. Overnight, Fletcher and Nimitz made a decision that would prove fatal. A salvage party of 170 volunteers, led by Buckmaster himself, went back on board. A destroyer, USS Hammond, tied up alongside to provide power and pumping. A minesweeper began preparations to tow Yorktown back to Pearl Harbor. They believed they had time. 250 miles away, a Japanese submarine commander named Yahachi Tanabe was running his boat, submerged, listening. Tanabe was 37 years old, a lieutenant commander in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and he had been tracking the American task force for 2 days. His submarine was I-168. He had been ordered to find and sink Yorktown specifically. On the afternoon of June 6th, he raised his periscope and saw exactly what he had been sent to find. He crept closer. He waited. He waited more. The American destroyer screen was tight, but not tight enough, because they were focused on protecting a wounded carrier that they no longer believed was in danger. At 13:31 on the afternoon of June 6th, Tanabe fired 4 torpedoes. 1 passed under Yorktown without exploding. 2 struck Yorktown amidships. The 4th hit USS Hammond, tied up on Yorktown's starboard side. Hammond broke in half. The destroyer sank in less than 4 minutes. As she went down, her depth charges, set for anti-submarine defense, detonated at their preset depths beneath her. The underwater shock wave killed dozens of Hammond sailors who had jumped clear and were swimming in the water. 80 of her crew of 241 were dead by nightfall. Yorktown herself lasted through the night. On the morning of June 7th, at 5:31, she finally rolled over and sank. 141 Americans died on Yorktown. Combined with the Hammond casualties, Tanabe's 4 torpedoes had killed more than 200 men in a single attack. And here is the lesson. Yorktown had survived the Japanese air attacks, both of them. The bombs did not kill her. The torpedoes from Hiryu's second wave did not kill her. What killed Yorktown was the American assumption that she was already saved. The salvage effort, the tow attempt, the tight schedule that kept the destroyer screen focused inward instead of outward, all of it was built on the belief that the danger had passed. The danger had not passed. It was sitting underwater 3 miles away, watching them through a periscope. The third lesson came 14 weeks later, in the Solomon Islands, and it came from a single submarine and a single spread of torpedoes. USS Wasp was CB-7. She was smaller than Lexington, smaller than Yorktown, built to a treaty-limited displacement that had forced her designers to cut weight in every part of the ship, including her armor and her damage control systems. Her captain in September of 1942 was Forrest Percival Sherman, 45 years old, and no relation to Frederick Sherman of Lexington, though the coincidence of names caused confusion in fleet correspondence for the entire war. On September 15th, Wasp was screening a convoy of transport ships carrying the 7th Marine Regiment as reinforcement for the fighting on Guadalcanal. Her escorts included the new battleship North Carolina and the destroyer O'Brien. Approaching them, submerged, was a Japanese submarine designated I-19. Her commander was Takakazu Kinashi, 40 years old, one of the most aggressive submarine skippers in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had been vectored into position by patrol aircraft that had spotted Wasp's course. At 14:44 in the afternoon, at a range of approximately 900 meters, Kinashi fired a full spread of 6 Type 95 torpedoes. What happened next is still, more than 80 years later, the most successful single torpedo salvo in the history of naval warfare. 3 of the 6 torpedoes hit Wasp on her starboard side. The remaining 3 did not stop. They continued running through the American formation. One of them ran for more than 5 miles before it struck the battleship North Carolina, blowing a hole in her hull below the waterline and taking her out of the campaign for months. Another one ran even farther and hit the destroyer O'Brien in the bow. O'Brien did not sink immediately. Her damage control saved her. She limped away, patched up, and began the long voyage back to the United States for repairs. 5 weeks later, on October 19th, 1,300 miles from where she had been hit, the strain of the ocean finally broke her damaged hull in half. She sank near the Samoan Islands. No one was killed in the actual sinking. Her crew was taken off in time, but O'Brien's death is directly attributed to Kinashi's torpedo. 1 Japanese submarine, 6 torpedoes, 3 American warships hit, a carrier sunk, a battleship crippled, a destroyer eventually broken in half. But the story of Wasp's death does not end with the torpedo hits. The torpedoes had struck near her aviation gasoline storage and her forward magazines. Within minutes, Wasp's damage control teams were fighting fires they could not reach and could not contain. Fuel lines cracked, vapor spread. A series of internal explosions began to march down the length of the ship. Wasp's death echoed Lexington's vulnerability to aviation fuel fires, but it was not simply the same design failure repeated. The torpedo hits themselves had ignited severe fires and disabled her fire mains almost instantly, and the lessons the Navy had begun to draw from Lexington had already led to some changes in how carriers handled aviation fuel. Those changes had not yet gone far enough, not for a ship that had taken 3 torpedoes at once, next to her fuel bunkers, in the middle of the afternoon. At 15:20, Forrest Sherman ordered Wasp abandoned. The destroyer USS Lansdowne fired 3 torpedoes to scuttle her that evening. 193 of her crew of approximately 2,100 were dead. Wasp was the last American fleet carrier lost to internal aviation gasoline vapor explosions in the Second World War. After Wasp, the Navy finally overhauled its fuel handling procedures in full. Fuel lines were purged with inert gas after use. Ventilation systems were redesigned. New ships were built with entirely different storage geometries. The fix worked. It had only taken 2 dead carriers and 400 dead sailors to get the Navy to make it. The fourth lesson, and the last of 1942, came 6 weeks later in a battle called Santa Cruz, and it involved a ship named for the city where it had all begun. USS Hornet was CV-8. She was the ship that had carried Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bombers to within striking distance of Tokyo in April, only 6 months before. She was the newest fleet carrier in the Pacific. Her captain was Charles Perry Mason, 51 years old, and the flag officer embarked was Rear Admiral George Dominic Murray, 53. On October 26th, in the waters north of the Santa Cruz Islands, Hornet ran into a Japanese carrier force built around Shokaku, Zuikaku, Junyo, and the light carrier Zuiho. Enterprise was the only other American fleet carrier present. Between them, they represented every operational fleet carrier the United States had in the entire Pacific. At 9:09 in the morning, Japanese dive bombers found Hornet. 3 bombs hit her flight deck in rapid succession. The first punched through several decks before exploding deep in the ship. The second was a high-explosive weapon that detonated on the flight deck itself. The third bore through into the crew's mess deck before it went off. Then 2 Japanese torpedoes struck Hornet on her starboard side. And then something happened that had not been seen before in American waters. A Japanese dive bomber, its aircraft mortally damaged by anti-aircraft fire, deliberately flew its plane into Hornet's exhaust funnel and exploded. Minutes later, a Japanese torpedo bomber, also damaged, rammed into Hornet's side. Neither of these acts was part of any organized program. They were individual pilots, making individual choices in the last seconds of their lives. The Japanese military had not yet invented the word kamikaze. That would come 2 years later. But the phenomenon it described had just, on this morning in October 42, appeared for the first time in the Pacific War. Hornet went dead in the water. Fires burned through her hangar deck. But her damage control teams got the flames under control by 10 in the morning. And by midday, the heavy cruiser USS Northampton had taken her under tow. Mason and Murray began to hope. Then, at 15:23, a second wave of Japanese torpedo bombers arrived. 1 torpedo hit. Hornet's list increased sharply. She lost all power. The tow line parted. Mason gave the order to abandon ship. And here is where the fourth lesson emerged. 2 American destroyers, USS Mustin and USS Anderson, were ordered to scuttle Hornet before the approaching Japanese surface force could reach her. They circled the burning carrier and fired 9 torpedoes. Most of them did not work. The Mark 15 torpedo was the standard American destroyer-launched torpedo of 1942. It had a magnetic detonator that was supposed to explode the warhead beneath a ship's keel. The detonator was defective. It had been defective for years. Reports from the fleet had been complaining about it since before the war began. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington had refused to accept that anything was wrong. Mustin and Anderson watched their torpedoes run past Hornet, or under her without exploding, or hit her hull and fail to detonate. When the torpedoes ran out, they opened fire with 5-inch guns. They fired more than 400 rounds into Hornet at point-blank range. She would not sink. Japanese surface ships were now less than an hour away. The 2 American destroyers were ordered to withdraw. They left Hornet burning, alone, on the empty ocean. At approximately 2100 hours, the Japanese destroyers Makigumo and Akigumo arrived. They circled Hornet in the darkness. They fired 4 Type 93 torpedoes into her hull. The Type 93, called the Long Lance by American Cruz, after the war was the finest surface-launched torpedo of the war. It was Japanese, it worked. Hornet finally rolled over and sank at 01:35 on the morning of October 27th. 140 of her crew were dead. Her total complement had been just over 2,200. Hornet was the last American fleet carrier lost in the Second World War. She was also the only American fleet carrier of the entire war, ultimately finished off by torpedoes fired from enemy destroyers after American attempts to scuttle her had failed with weapons that would not detonate. She had been sunk in the end by better Japanese weapons than her own escorts carried. By the last week of October 1942, the arithmetic of the Pacific War had collapsed to a single number. 7 fleet carriers on December 7, 1941, 4 dead, Lexington in the Coral Sea, Yorktown at Midway, Wasp in the Solomons, Hornet at Santa Cruz. 2 more Ranger and Saratoga were operating in the Atlantic or in West Coast waters, refitting out of the fight. That left one, USS Enterprise. She was burning too. She had been hit by 2 bombs at Santa Cruz. Her forward elevator was jammed in the up position. Her flight deck had a hole in it. She was steaming at reduced speed toward the anchorage at Noumea on New Caledonia for emergency repairs. She was the only operational American fleet carrier in the entire Pacific Ocean. At Pearl Harbor, on the night of October 26th, Admiral Chester Nimitz received the report on Hornet's abandonment. He was 57 years old. He was the man responsible for every ship, every sailor, every square mile of ocean west of California. He walked to his situation map, and on the placard for Hornet, he drew a single line through the ship's name. He had drawn the same line through 3 names before it in the last 5 months. Enterprise was all he had left. Before she sailed from Noumea a few days later, dock workers hung a hand-painted banner over her hangar deck. American war correspondents saw it, photographed it, and printed it in newspapers across the United States within a week. The banner read, "Enterprise versus Japan." It was meant as bravado. It was received as bravado. It was also, on that night in late October 1942, an entirely accurate statement of the strategic situation. 4 American carriers were dead. Each of them had died differently. Lexington had died of a fuel system flaw the Navy had known about for years. Yorktown had died because the Navy had assumed she was safe. Wasp had died because one Japanese submarine commander was better at his job than anyone in the American fleet had believed possible. Hornet had died in part because American torpedoes did not work. 4 ships, 4 lessons. 690 Americans dead across those 4 crews alone, and thousands more on their escorts and their salvage vessels. And the war was 34 months from ending. 7 more American aircraft carriers would sink before it was over. The methods would change. The weapons would change. The oceans would sometimes change. But the pattern that had emerged in 1942, the pattern of American ships, dying not from a single overwhelming blow, but from the small, accumulated, unaddressed failures of American doctrine and American design, would repeat itself again and again until August of 1945. The next chapter of that story would begin, not with a fleet carrier, but with a new kind of ship. A ship the Navy had built cheaply, a ship the Navy had built quickly, a ship the Navy had built by the dozen, and sent into combat with the understanding, rarely spoken aloud, that some of them were not going to come back. A ship class called the Escort carrier, and on a morning in November 1943, one of them was going to die faster and more violently than any American carrier before or after her. Her name was Liscome Bay. We began this story with her. We are about to return to her. By the summer of 1943, the American shipbuilding industry was doing something the Japanese Empire could not have imagined a year earlier. It was building aircraft carriers faster than the enemy could sink them. The first of the Essex-class fleet carriers, USS Essex herself, had been commissioned in December of 42. By the end of 43, 5 more had joined her. Yorktown, the second ship of that name, replacing the one Yahachi Tanabe had killed at Midway. Lexington, the second of that name, too, replacing the Lady Lex that had exploded from within in the Coral Sea. Intrepid, Bunker Hill, Wasp, yes, another Wasp. The names of the dead ships were being resurrected on new hulls, faster than the Navy could paint them. 24 Essex-class carriers would eventually be commissioned. 9 light carriers of the Independence class would join them. And alongside these fleet units, a completely different kind of ship was rolling off American slipways in numbers that would have seemed absurd in 1941. The Escort carrier, small, slow, cheaply built, constructed on merchant ship hulls or on hulls originally intended as tankers, and completed as flat-tops in yards that had never built a warship before the war. They displaced a third of what a fleet carrier displaced. Their flight decks were shorter. They carried fewer planes. They could barely make 18 knots on their best day, and they had almost no armor. The Navy called them CVEs. The sailors who served on them, more honestly, called them combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. The joke was funnier when you were not standing on one. By the end of the war, the United States would build more than 100 of them. 6 of them would not come back. The first was Liscome Bay. We began this story with her death. Now we return to how it happened. November 24th, 1943. In the waters near Makin Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. She was CVE 56. She had been commissioned in August, only 3 months before. Her crew had trained together for weeks, not years. Many of the sailors on board had never seen combat. The flag officer riding her was Rear Admiral Henry Marston Mullinix. He was 51 years old, a career naval aviator, and he had taken command of Task Group 52.13 for the invasion of the Gilbert Islands. The captain of the ship itself was Irving Day Wiltsey, 47 years old, another aviator, another Annapolis graduate. Both men would be dead within 23 minutes. Also on board was a mess attendant third class named Doris Miller. He was 24 years old. He was from Waco, Texas. He had joined the Navy in 1939 because he was a black American in the American South, and the Navy was one of the few institutions that offered him a paying job. At the time he enlisted, the United States Navy did not allow black sailors to serve in any combat rating. Miller was assigned as a mess attendant. He served food, he cleaned staterooms, he did the laundry of white officers. On December 7, 1941, while serving on the battleship USS West Virginia at Pearl Harbor, Miller had helped carry his mortally wounded captain to shelter and had then manned an anti-aircraft machine gun, a weapon he had never been trained to operate, and fired at attacking Japanese aircraft until his ammunition was gone. He was awarded the Navy Cross in May of 1942. He was the first black American in the history of the United States Navy to receive that decoration. His photograph appeared on a wartime recruiting poster. His name appeared in newspapers. His story appeared in speeches. 1 year and 11 months later, in the pre-dawn darkness near Makin Atoll, he was still serving in the Navy's segregated steward branch. The Navy had not changed its rating rules. The recruiting poster had not been enough to give him a combat job. He was cleaning up in the aft galley when the torpedo hit. The submarine was I-175. Her commander was Sunao Tabata. He had been shadowing Liscome Bay's task group for hours in the darkness. At 5:10 in the morning, as Liscome Bay was completing a routine turn to bring her into the wind for launching aircraft, Tabata fired a spread of torpedoes. Only one hit. It struck her starboard side, just aft of the engine room. Directly above the point of impact, in a storage compartment separated from the sea, by nothing more than the hull plating and one bulkhead, was the aviation bomb magazine. The magazine had been stocked overnight for the morning's airstrikes. It contained several tons of high explosive. The Japanese torpedo did not just breach the hull. It detonated inside the magazine. The explosion was seen 1,500 meters away on the bridge of the battleship USS New Mexico. Sailors on New Mexico's decks who looked up at the flash later said the entire southern horizon had turned white, a white so bright and so sustained that for a full second it seemed as if the sun had come up 90 minutes early in the wrong part of the sky. Debris rained down on New Mexico's forward turret. Some of it was metal. Some of it was pieces of aircraft. Some of it was pieces of Liscome Bay's crew. Aboard Liscome Bay, the aft third of the ship had ceased to exist. Naught was destroyed. Naught was damaged beyond repair. It had ceased to exist. The stern of the ship was gone, vaporized or hurled into the sea in fragments. The forward two-thirds of the hull, still moving forward through the water at 15 knots, was already sinking. Rear Admiral Mulinix was on the flag bridge when the magazine exploded. He was killed instantly. Captain Wiltsey was near him. He was killed instantly. Doris Miller was somewhere in the aft galley when the torpedo hit. His body was never recovered. He is one of more than 600 Americans whose remains are still on the ocean floor with the ship. Liscome Bay sank in 23 minutes. 272 men were pulled from the water in the following hours. The rest, nearly two-thirds of her total complement, were dead. In terms of raw numbers of American sailors killed on a single carrier in a single incident, Liscome Bay's loss remains the worst in the history of the United States Navy. She had been in the Pacific for 11 weeks, and the lesson, if anyone in Washington was still counting lessons, was written into her hull design itself. The magazine had been unarmored. The Navy had known this. The trade-off had been made deliberately. On paper in 1942, cheap ships quickly built in large numbers at the cost of protection. The trade-off was accepted. The trade-off would continue to be accepted for the entire rest of the war. 5 more CVEs would die because of it. Before we return to the Pacific, we have one American carrier to account for in a different ocean. May 29, 1944, 200 miles west of the Canary Islands. The middle of the Atlantic, USS Block Island CVE-21 was hunting submarines. Her captain was Frances Massey Hughes. She was part of what the Navy called a hunter-killer group, a small task force of 1 escort carrier and 3 or 4 destroyer escorts dedicated entirely to finding and killing German U-boats in the trade routes of the Atlantic. Block Island had been at this work for months. She had accounted for 2 U-boats destroyed on her own and had shared credit for 2 more. That evening, a German submarine designated U-549 slipped past her destroyer screen. Her commander was Captain-Lieutenant Detlev Krankhals. He was 27 years old. He had commanded U-549 for less than 4 months. He had never sunk anything before. He fired a spread of torpedoes at Block Island in the fading light. 2 struck her almost simultaneously, 1 at the bow, 1 at the stern, penetrating an ordnance magazine and rupturing an oil tank. A 3rd torpedo hit her a few minutes later. Block Island lost power. She began to settle. Captain Hughes ordered her abandoned. Her damage control efforts, which on a fleet carrier might have bought her hours, ran out of time in the space of an hour and a half. She sank at 8:55 in the evening. 6 of her crew were killed in the torpedo blasts. 951 were rescued by the surrounding destroyer escorts. And then the destroyer escort USS Eugene E. Elmore went hunting. Elmore's sonar operators picked up U-549 within the hour. They ran in on her, close to point-blank range, and fired Hedgehog mortar patterns into the darkness. Hedgehogs were forward-throwing anti-submarine mortars. They fired a pattern of 24 contact-fused bombs ahead of the ship. Unlike depth charges, they only exploded if they actually hit something. When they hit, they killed submarines fast. They hit U-549. The German submarine imploded somewhere below 300 meters. All 57 of her crew died. Captain-Lieutenant Krankhals, 27 years old, in command of his own boat for less than 4 months, credited with sinking his first Allied warship less than 2 hours earlier, was among the dead. Block Island was the only American aircraft carrier lost in the Atlantic theater during the entire Second World War. She has one other distinction. Her name was reassigned to a new escort carrier the following year, CVE 106, which was still under construction at the time of her sinking. The new block island served for the rest of the war and beyond. She is the only American aircraft carrier to have had a successor ship of the same name in commission during the same war in which she was sunk. The Navy did not always work that way. But for Block Island, the shipyards had already been working, and the paperwork was easy. The dead sailors were not brought back so easily. We now return to the Pacific, and to a day that historians of naval warfare consider one of the strangest and bloodiest single days in the history of the American Navy. October 24th and 25th, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It was the largest naval battle in human history. It involved more than 300 ships, spread across an area of ocean larger than the entire country of France. It was fought in 4 separate major engagements on 2 separate days in 3 different bodies of water. 2 American carriers died in it. They died in ways that were completely different from each other and completely different from anything that had come before. The first was Princeton. USS Princeton was CVL-23. She was a light carrier. The L in the designation stood for light, built on the hull of what had originally been a Cleveland-class light cruiser. She was fast. She could make 31 knots. She carried 33 aircraft. She had been in the Pacific for 15 months, had participated in nearly every major American offensive of 1943 and 44, and had never been hit by an enemy weapon. Her captain was William Henry Barraker. He was 49 years old, an Annapolis graduate, a career aviator. On the morning of October 24th, 1944, Princeton was operating in the Sibuyan Sea, providing air cover for the American forces engaged in the opening moves of the Leyte Gulf battle. Her fighters had been in the air since dawn, engaging Japanese aircraft flying from land bases on Luzon. At 9:38 in the morning, a single Japanese aircraft slipped through the American combat air patrol. It was a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy, a dive bomber. There was only one of it. Its pilot's name is not recorded in any surviving Japanese source. He was most probably a young lieutenant or ensign. He was almost certainly on a conventional bombing mission, not a suicide mission. Kamikaze operations had not yet begun. He dove on Princeton from 20,000 feet. He released a single bomb, a 250-kilogram armor-piercing weapon, from an altitude of around 1,500 feet. Then he pulled up and disappeared to the west. No American gunner saw him leave. No American aircraft caught him. He is presumed to have returned safely to his base on Luzon. His single bomb hit Princeton in the middle of her flight deck. It punched through the flight deck. It punched through the hangar deck. It exploded on the deck below. The initial damage was not catastrophic. Princeton's fires were confined at first to a small section of her hangar. Her damage control teams began fighting them within minutes. Her captain slowed her to bring her into the wind. Her crew began to believe the situation was under control. But the bomb had exploded near a formation of 6 torpedo bombers that had been parked in her hangar with their weapons already loaded for a later strike. 6 torpedoes, each with hundreds of pounds of high explosive in the warhead. They began to cook off one at a time in the fire. The first internal torpedo explosion came around 10 in the morning. The second came a few minutes later. Each one blew a new hole in Princeton's structure. Each one killed more of her damage control parties. Each one made the fire worse. The light cruiser USS Birmingham came alongside to help. Her captain was Thomas Bell Inglis, 47 years old, a fighter of a naval officer with a reputation for aggressive ship handling. Inglis brought Birmingham right up alongside Princeton, close enough that his sailors could throw fire hoses across the gap. 2 other American ships joined the effort, the destroyer USS Morrison and the destroyer USS Irwin. Morrison actually became wedged between Princeton's stack and her radio antenna, hung up on the burning carrier like a matchbox against a house on fire. Her crew fought to free her while spraying water at flames that were now spreading forward along Princeton's flight deck. By early afternoon, the fires seemed to be losing ground. Birmingham had pumped thousands of gallons of seawater into Princeton's compartments. Morrison had been freed. The situation again seemed to be improving. At 15:23 in the afternoon, roughly 400 100-pound general-purpose bombs stored in Princeton's after torpedo stowage compartment detonated all at once in a catastrophic mass explosion. That is what the post-war Navy War Damage Report concluded. Not the torpedoes on the planes, though those had contributed to the fire. Not a single lucky spark. A whole magazine of bombs cooking together in the heat, letting go in one blast. The explosion tore off the entire back third of Princeton's flight deck. Debris was hurled hundreds of meters in every direction. Steel plating the size of automobiles was flung into the sea. Most of it flew over the top of Birmingham. Some of it did not. Birmingham was standing less than 50 feet from Princeton at the moment of the explosion. Her deck was crowded with sailors, firefighters, hose handlers, damage control parties, medical corpsmen who had come across to help with Princeton's wounded. All of them were exposed. All of them were unprotected. The blast wave hit them first. Then came the metal. When it was over, Birmingham's upper decks were, in the words of one surviving officer, like a slaughterhouse floor. 233 sailors on Birmingham were dead. 426 were wounded, many of them so severely that they would spend the rest of their lives disfigured. Captain Inglis himself was wounded. He wrote in his action report that the after effects on his ship's decks were the worst thing he had ever seen in a career at sea. The men killed on Birmingham had not been on the ship that was attacked. They had been on the ship that came to help. Princeton herself, by comparison, had lost 108 of her own crew. Most of the rest, more than 1,400 sailors, had already been evacuated to Birmingham and other ships before the aft magazine went up. The rescuers had died in greater numbers than the rescued. That is what it means to be inside a burning aircraft carrier's blast radius when her ordnance goes up. The destroyer USS Irwin was ordered to sink what was left of Princeton with torpedoes. She fired 6. Several ran erratically. Some ran in circles, some detonated prematurely. The Mark 15 torpedo, 2 years after Hornet, was still failing. The light cruiser USS Reno finally sank Princeton with torpedoes of her own at 5:50 in the afternoon. Princeton was the only American light carrier lost in the entire Second World War. She had been killed by one aircraft, dropping one bomb. Everything else that killed her was American. On the same day, in a different body of water, the American fleet was about to make its worst tactical mistake of the entire Pacific War. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the Third Fleet, took his entire force of fast carriers, including his battleships, and steamed north, chasing a Japanese carrier decoy force that had been sent specifically to lure him away. He left the entrance to Leyte Gulf uncovered. Behind him, coming through the San Bernardino Strait in the darkness, was the main Japanese battle fleet. October 25th, 6:37 in the morning, the waters east of the Philippine island of Samar. A task group of American escort carriers, codenamed Taffy 3, was launching aircraft for the morning's ground support missions over the Leyte beaches. The commander of Taffy 3 was Rear Admiral Clifton Albert Frederick Sprague. He was 48 years old. His nickname in the fleet was Ziggy. He had 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts under his command. He was not a battle line commander. He was a jeep carrier admiral. His job that morning, as he understood it, was to support the Marines and soldiers ashore. At 6:37, one of his search planes reported 4 Japanese battleships on the horizon. Sprague's first response, over his radio, was to correct the pilot. The pilot must be mistaken. There were no Japanese battleships in that quadrant. The pilot was probably seeing American ships from Halsey's group. Then the first Japanese salvo landed among his escort carriers. The shells were 14-inch. Some were 16-inch. Some, Sprague would later learn, were 18.1-inch, fired from the largest guns ever mounted on any warship in human history. The Japanese commander bearing down on Taffy 3 was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. He was 55 years old. He had 4 battleships, including the super battleship Yamato. He had 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Sprague had 6 escort carriers. Their gun armament per ship consisted of exactly one 5-inch gun mounted at the stern. The Japanese force outweighed the American force in gunfire by a ratio of approximately 100-to-1. Sprague ordered his carriers to run east into a rain squall and ordered his destroyers and destroyer escorts to attack. They attacked. USS Johnston, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Ernest Edwin Evans, 36 years old, of Cherokee and Creek descent, one of the first Native Americans ever to command a United States warship, turned toward the Japanese fleet and charged. Johnston was 2,000 tons. She carried 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedoes. She attacked the Japanese heavy cruiser force by herself at first and put 2 torpedoes into the heavy cruiser Kumano, blowing off her bow. Then USS Hole and USS Samuel B. Roberts joined the attack. Then the destroyer escorts of Taffy 3. Then Johnston again, having circled back into the fight after her initial run, engaging Japanese destroyers with her 5-inch guns at ranges under 5,000 yards. All 3 American ships, Johnston, Hole, and Samuel B. Roberts, were sunk that morning. Evans went down with Johnston. His body was never recovered. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation is a matter of public record. It describes what he did. It does not and cannot describe why he did it, except in the operational sense, that if his destroyer had not attacked, the Japanese fleet would have reached the vulnerable escort carriers of Taffy 3 much sooner than it did. Behind the destroyers, one of those escort carriers was already dying. USS Gambier Bay was CVE 73. Her captain was Walter Vuegg, 48 years old. Just after 8 in the morning, she began taking hits from Japanese heavy cruiser gunfire. Then more. Then, before 9, a battleship-caliber shell tore into her aft engine room. Gambier Bay's speed dropped. Then it stopped altogether. She began to list. Japanese heavy cruisers Tone, Haguro, and Shikuma closed to point-blank range and continued firing. At the end, they were shooting at her from less than 10,000 yards. She was hit repeatedly by Japanese heavy gunfire, including cruiser and battleship-caliber shells. The exact attribution of individual large-caliber hits on Gambier Bay is still disputed. Japanese and American accounts differ over whether Yamato herself or the battleship Congo scored particular hits. What is not disputed is what those hits did. Captain Vuegg gave the order to abandon ship at 9:07. Gambier Bay rolled onto her port side and sank at 9:11 in the morning. 121 of her crew were killed. More than 800 abandoned into the water and floated for the next 2 days, some as long as 48 hours, before rescue ships arrived to pull them out. Sharks took some of them during that time. Exposure took others. Gambier Bay was the only American aircraft carrier in the entire Second World War to be sunk exclusively by enemy surface gunfire. She is also, in the broader history of naval warfare, one of the last major warships of any nation ever sunk by battleship-class gunnery in open water. And then, at 9:11 in the morning, at the exact minute Gambier Bay was going under, something happened that historians have argued about for 80 years. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, standing on the flag bridge of Yamato, gave the order to turn his fleet around. He was 3 hours steaming time from Leyte Gulf. The Gulf's entrance was undefended. Behind him were the sinking hulks of 3 American destroyers, 1 American escort carrier, and he believed several more damaged American ships. His own losses had been serious. 3 heavy cruisers sunk, others damaged. But he still had 4 battleships and enough firepower to devastate the American amphibious force he had been sent to destroy. He turned north. Then, hours later, he turned back east briefly. Then he turned north again for good. In post-war interrogations, conducted by American naval intelligence officers, Kurita gave several different explanations. The ferocity of the American destroyer attacks had convinced him he was engaging fleet carriers of the fast carrier force, not escort carriers. He had received a garbled radio report suggesting American battleships were closing on his position from the north. His fuel state was becoming a concern. His crews were exhausted. None of these explanations, taken alone or together, has fully satisfied historians. What is beyond dispute is what his decision saved. 200,000 American servicemen were ashore or in the transport ships at Leyte Gulf on the morning of October 25th. Had Kurita entered the Gulf, most of them would have been within range of his battleships within 4 hours. The transport fleet, unarmored, packed with men and supplies, would have been slaughtered. The invasion of the Philippines would have been thrown back into chaos. The final phase of the war in the Pacific would have been extended by months, perhaps longer. Ernest Evans on Johnston, the sailors on Hull and Samuel B. Roberts, the 121 dead on Gambier Bay. None of them knew they had saved the invasion. Most of them died before it was clear that they had. The men who lived through Samar rarely spoke about it in public afterward. Some spoke to each other at reunions. Some spoke to their families, late in life, in fragments. Most did not. Kurita himself lived to be 88 years old. He died in December of 1977. He never gave a full public account of what had gone through his mind on the flag bridge of Yamato at 9/11 on the morning of October 25th, 1944. Whatever it was, it stopped his fleet at the moment when it could have changed the course of the war. But Kurita's retreat was not the end of the day for Taffy 3, because 2 hours later, at 10:47 in the morning, 5 specks appeared in the sky to the east of the American escort carriers. They were Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters. Each of them carried a 250-kilogram bomb wired to its underwing. The leader of the 5-plane formation was Lieutenant Yukio Seki. He was 23 years old. He had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Iwo Jima in November of 1941, in the class known as the 70th class. He had married his wife, Mariko, 5 months before this morning. 5 days earlier, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi had arrived in the Philippines and had begun forming the first organized Japanese naval special attack units in history. At the airfield at Mabalacat on Luzon, through the chain of command that ran under him, Lieutenant Yukio Seki was chosen to lead the unit that would be called Shikishima, an ancient poetic name for the home islands of Japan. Seki had accepted the assignment. What he thought of it in private is a matter for which we have only fragmentary and second-hand testimony from other pilots. What is documented is that on the morning of October 25th, he led his 4 wingmen off the airstrip at Mabalacat, flew east over the sea, and found Taffy 3. At 10:53 in the morning, one of the attacking Zero fighters struck USS St. Lo, CVE 63. Her captain was Francis Joseph McKenna, 47 years old. His gunners saw the aircraft coming. They fired, they missed. The Zero struck the flight deck of St. Lo, just aft of the forward elevator. The bomb detonated inside the hangar deck. In the hangar, aircraft were being fueled and armed for the next sortie. Aviation gasoline was in open lines. Torpedoes and bombs were on their handling dollies. Everything that could burn was burning within seconds. Everything that could explode began to explode. A series of 6 secondary explosions, each one larger than the last, ripped through St. Lo's structure. Her flight deck peeled back like the lid of a can. Her stern lifted and dropped and lifted again. She sank at 11:25. More than 100 of her men were killed or mortally wounded. Different official and later accounts give slightly different totals. What is not in dispute is that St. Lo was the first warship in the history of naval warfare ever sunk by an organized suicide attack. Whether the Zero that killed her was the aircraft flown personally by Lieutenant Yukio Seki or by one of his 4 wingmen is a question the surviving evidence does not settle for certain. What is certain is that Seki led the mission, that Seki died on that mission, and that the tactic he flew that morning was about to become the defining Japanese weapon of the last year of the war. In the 10 months that followed, Japanese kamikaze operations would kill more than 4,900 American and Allied sailors. 34 Allied ships, including 3 of the 11 American carriers we are counting in this story, would be sunk by them. Hundreds more would be damaged. The tactic that had appeared for the first time, in fragmentary and individual form, on the burning deck of Hornet at Santa Cruz 2 years earlier, had now been organized, institutionalized, and given a name. Lieutenant Yukio Seki had died at 23 years of age, in the cockpit of a Zero fighter above the sea east of Samar. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the man who had built the program that sent him, would live to see Japan's defeat and would take his own life by ritual suicide in his home in the hours after Japan's surrender was announced. Between the two of them, the young lieutenant and the old admiral, lay a program that was, by any honest measure, a confession. A confession that Japan had run out of pilots. A confession that Japan had run out of aircraft. A confession that Japan had run out of hope in the conventional forms of war. But the confession did not stop the ships from dying. 3 more American aircraft carriers would sink before the war was over. All 3 would be killed by kamikaze aircraft. The first of them would go down in the Sulu Sea in January of 1945. The second would go down off Iwo Jima in February. The third would be the last carrier lost. Their names, in order, were Omni Bay, Bismarck Sea, and But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We have one more chapter to tell. It is the chapter of the ending. It is the chapter of what all of this cost. And it is the chapter that answers, in the fullest and most honest way we can, the question printed at the top of this video. How many United States aircraft carriers were sunk in the Second World War? And what did their sinking mean? By the first week of January 1945, the American war machine had reached a scale of production that would have seemed impossible in 1941. The United States Navy now had more aircraft carriers in commission than every other navy in the world combined. Essex-class fleet carriers were operating in task groups of 4 and 5 at a time. Independence-class light carriers ran alongside them, and behind those fleet units, more than 50 escort carriers were in service, spread from the Aleutians to the Philippines, from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean. The math of the Pacific War had inverted itself completely, but the killing had not stopped. The killing had only changed shape. Because the Japanese Empire, having lost its battleships and its fleet carriers, and most of its trained pilots, had settled on a form of warfare that did not require any of those things. It required young men. It required aircraft that could fly one way. It required the willingness, at the highest levels of the Imperial Japanese Navy, to spend those young men as ammunition. By January of 45, that willingness was no longer in doubt. January 4th, 1945. The Sulu Sea, west of the Philippines. Late afternoon. USS Omni Bay was CVE 79. She was 1 year old. Her captain was Howard Leyland Young, 50 years old, an Annapolis graduate who had flown at Pearl Harbor as a squadron commander 3 years earlier. Omni Bay was steaming with a task group headed for Leyte Gulf, where the American invasion of Luzon was scheduled to begin in 5 days. Her aircraft had been in the air all afternoon. Her flight deck was crowded with returning planes being refueled and rearmed for the next mission. At 5:12 in the afternoon, a single Japanese aircraft appeared out of the low sun. It was a Yokosuka P-1Y, code-named Francis by the Allies. It was a twin-engine bomber, Its pilot's name is not recorded. He had approached from a direction where the setting sun made him nearly invisible to the American lookouts and to the ship's radar operators. By the time he was spotted, he was less than 500 meters away and diving. He passed low over Omani Bay's superstructure, clipped it with his wingtip, and released 2 bombs. Both bombs went into the ship before he did. The first bomb detonated in the hangar space, where Omani Bay's aircraft were being fueled. Aviation gasoline lines ruptured. Fires spread instantly across the hangar deck. The second bomb went deeper. It passed through the hangar deck, through the compartment below it, and detonated in one of the engine rooms. Then the Francis itself struck the flight deck and disintegrated. Within minutes, the fires were beyond control. Omani Bay's damage control parties fought where they could reach, but the internal explosions had already ruptured the fire mains in 3 places. Ammunition began cooking off. Torpedoes stored in the aft magazine began to heat. Captain Young ordered the ship abandoned at 5:50 in the afternoon. Just after the last of the crew had left her, the torpedo magazine exploded. Debris from Omani Bay flew hundreds of meters. 2 sailors on a nearby destroyer, standing on their own ship's deck to help pull survivors out of the water, were killed by pieces of metal that came out of the sky. They had been trying to save the men of Omani Bay. They died because they had come too close. The destroyer USS Burns sank the burning wreck with a torpedo that evening. 95 members of Omani Bay's crew were dead. A little over 800 survived. 1 aircraft, 1 pilot, 2 bombs. An escort carrier destroyed in less than 3 hours. The math of the kamikaze had never been more clear. 6 weeks later, it happened again. February 21st, 1945, 50 miles off the coast of Iwo Jima. The American invasion of Iwo Jima had begun 2 days earlier. On the black volcanic beaches of the island, 6,000 Marines would die in the next 36 days. 19,000 more would be wounded. It would become, and would remain, one of the costliest battles in the history of the United States Marine Corps. Providing air support offshore in the dying light of that late February evening was a group of escort carriers. Among them was USS Bismarck C, CVE 95. Her captain was John Lawrence Pratt. At dusk, Japanese aircraft lifted off from bases in southern Japan and Chichijima. They had one mission. They were not coming back. The Bismarck C's radar detected them. 6 of the incoming aircraft split off from the main group and turned toward the escort carrier task unit. 5 of them were Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers codenamed Jill. One was a Mitsubishi G4M the Betty, a twin-engine medium bomber. American gunners shot down the Betty first. Then one of the 5 Jills, apparently deciding that its original target had become too heavily defended, broke off from an attack run on the escort carrier USS Lunga Point and turned toward Bismarck C instead. It came in low, very low, from the starboard side at an angle so shallow that Bismarck C's 5-inch and 40mm guns could not depress their barrels low enough to engage the target. The gunners fired anyway. The tracer rounds went over the top of the incoming aircraft. The Jill crashed into Bismarck C's hangar deck at the level of the ordnance handling area. It penetrated deep into the ship before its bomb exploded. Ammunition in the magazine spaces began to detonate almost immediately. The forward elevator cables snapped from the shock. The elevator itself, weighing several tons, fell freely from the flight deck into the hangar below, crushing whoever was underneath it. Bismarck C began to lose way. Fires spread rapidly. Then, 3 minutes later, another kamikaze hit her. This one struck aft, near the section of the ship where the damage control parties had been trying to organize their response. It killed most of them. The men who had been fighting to save the ship were now dead, and the ship was on its own. Fires now burned uncontrolled through her hangar. Explosions marched down her length. She began to list to starboard. At 7 in the evening, Captain Pratt gave the order to abandon ship. Sailors jumped from the flight deck into the water. Others slid down knotted lines. In the fading light, small boats and destroyers moved through the burning debris field, pulling men out one at a time. A larger explosion almost certainly her aviation gasoline stores. Going up, tore off much of her stern. She rolled onto her side and slipped beneath the surface at approximately 9:30 in the evening. Of her crew of more than 900, 318 were dead. Bismarck C was the last American aircraft carrier lost in the Second World War. She has one other distinction. Her hull rests on the seabed north of Iwo Jima, roughly on the same latitude as the beaches where the Marines were still fighting. In a rough historical sense, she died within sight of the battle she had come to support. The men who went down with her had done so in the service of the men on the island. 6,000 of those men on the island were also going to die. 6 weeks after Bismarck C sank, on April 1st, 1945, American forces landed on Okinawa. In the 82 days that followed, Japanese kamikaze attacks would sink more Allied warships and damage many more. Nearly 5,000 American sailors would die in that campaign. None of the ships sunk at Okinawa was an aircraft carrier, not for lack of Japanese effort. Fleet carriers Bunker Hill and Franklin were both struck by kamikazes and were both nearly lost. Franklin was hit on the morning of March 19th by a single Japanese bomber that put 2 bombs into her flight deck when it was crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. More than 700 of her crew died, more than any of the carriers we have counted in this story except Liscome Bay. But Franklin did not sink. She was towed away and then, in stages, brought under her own power back across the Pacific. She was still afloat when the war ended. Bunker Hill was hit twice by kamikazes off Okinawa in May. Nearly 400 of her men died. She did not sink either. They were built better than the ships that had come before them. Their damage control was better. Their crews were better trained. The lessons that had been paid for in the blood of Lexington and Yorktown and Wasp and Hornet, of Liscome Bay and Princeton and St. Lo had been learned late, and at a cost that no accounting could ever fully measure, but they had been learned. 11 American aircraft carriers were sunk in the Second World War, not one more. The last of them was Bismarck C on February 21, 1945. Between her loss and Japan's surrender on the deck of the battleship Missouri on September 2, 1945, 6 months and 11 days went by without the loss of a single American flight deck. Now let us count. 11 ships, 4 fleet carriers, Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp, Hornet, all lost in the first year of the war. 1 light carrier, Princeton, killed by a single bomb from a single aircraft that its own pilot almost certainly survived. 6 escort carriers, Liscome Bay, Block Island, Gambier Bay, St. Lo, Omni Bay, Bismarck C. 6 ships built to a cheap standard, sent into combat with the quiet acknowledgement that some of them would not come home. Divided by the mechanism of loss, the numbers look like this, but each ship's death is more complicated than a single category. 4 American carriers were killed principally by submarines. Yorktown, Wasp, Liscome Bay, Block Island, Lexington, Hornet, and Princeton were all mortally damaged in air attack, but their actual sinkings had different mechanisms. Lexington was crippled by torpedoes and bombs, and then destroyed from within by aviation gasoline vapor explosions and fires her crew could no longer reach. Hornet was crippled by repeated air attack, including 2 aircraft that deliberately rammed her, and was ultimately sent to the bottom by Japanese destroyer torpedoes after American attempts to scuttle her had failed. Princeton was disabled by a single bomb, and then destroyed by uncontrollable fires and the catastrophic secondary detonation of the bombs stowed in her after magazine. 3 were killed by organized kamikaze attacks, St. Lo, Omni Bay, Bismarck C. 1 was killed by surface gunfire alone. Gambier Bay, the last major warship in history, sunk exclusively by battleship class and cruiser gunnery in open water. More than 3,000 American sailors died on those 11 ships. Roughly 1,000 more died on the escorts that fought alongside them on the destroyers Hammond and O'Brien and Johnston and Hole and Samuel B. Roberts, and on the cruiser Birmingham. Thousands more were wounded, some for a few weeks, some for the rest of their lives. The Japanese, over the same 4 years, lost 25 aircraft carriers of all types, more than double the American figure. And the men who commanded those Japanese carriers, in most cases, did not survive their ships. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the 6 fleet carriers that struck Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941, died by his own hand in a command post on Saipan on the 6th of July, 1944. He was 57 years old. Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi, the architect of the kamikaze program, committed ritual suicide in his home in the early hours of the 16th of August, 1945 hours after the Japanese surrender was announced. He left a written apology to the young pilots he had ordered to their deaths. He refused deliberately to use anesthetics or to allow his family to assist him. He took 12 hours to die. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, whose fleet had turned away from Leyte Gulf at 9/11 on the morning of October 25, 1944, lived on. He returned to Japan after the war. He taught for a time at the Naval Academy at Iwo Jima. He died in December of 1977, at the age of 88. In more than 3 decades of post-war life, he never once gave a full public account of why he had turned his fleet around. There are 3 lessons buried in the graves of the 11 American carriers. The first is a lesson about aviation gasoline. Lexington and Wasp both died in large part because of vapor from aviation fuel that leaked into sealed compartments and found sources of ignition. The Navy had designed the ventilation systems on those ships in the 1920s. The Navy had believed the systems were adequate. They were not. After Wasp died in September of '42, the Navy fully overhauled its fuel handling procedures. Fuel lines were purged with inert gas after each use. Ventilation was redesigned. New ships were built with entirely different fuel storage geometries. The fix worked. No American fleet carrier was ever again lost to internal fuel vapor explosions. 2 ships and 400 men were the tuition for that lesson. The second lesson is a lesson about torpedoes. The American Mark 15 destroyer-launched torpedo in the first 2 years of the war did not work reliably. Its magnetic detonator was defective. Its depth-keeping mechanism was defective. Its contact fuse was defective. Hornet, at Santa Cruz in October '42, could not be sunk by 9 American torpedoes and more than 400 rounds of 5-inch shell fire, and had to be finished off by Japanese destroyers using Japanese torpedoes. Princeton, 2 years later at Leyte Gulf, could not be sunk by the 6 torpedoes fired by the American destroyer Irwin, and had to be finished off by the light cruiser Reno using her own torpedoes. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, which was responsible for the design and testing of American torpedoes, denied that there was any problem with them for 20 months. Fleet commanders complained. Submarine skippers complained. Their complaints were filed and shelved and forgotten. Only in mid-1943, when live-fire testing on the cliffs of Kahulawe in Hawaii finally proved beyond argument that the Mark 15 and its cousin, the Mark 14, were defective, did the Bureau begin to fix the problem. By then, an unknowable number of American ships, including 2 American aircraft carriers, had died in part because of it. No one was ever held publicly accountable. The third lesson is the deepest one. The escort carrier, the CVE, the combustible, vulnerable and expendable ship, was a design compromise that the Navy made deliberately, on paper, in 1942. The choice was between building fewer ships to a higher standard, or many ships to a lower one. The Navy chose many ships. The choice was strategically correct. There is no serious historian today who argues otherwise. Without the CVEs, The American war in the Atlantic against the U-boats could not have been won when it was won. Without the CVEs, the American amphibious campaigns across the Pacific could not have been supported the way they were. The escort carrier was the workhorse of the American naval war effort. In pure operational terms, it delivered exactly what it had been designed to deliver. But the compromise had a cost, and the cost was paid by human beings. Liscome Bay, St. Lo, Omani Bay, Bismarck Sea. 4 escort carriers, 4 magazine detonations, more than 1,100 American sailors killed, almost all of them because the ships had no meaningful armor over their ordnance stowage. A single bomb, a single torpedo, a single kamikaze aircraft could turn a CVE into a floating bomb in seconds. The Navy knew this. The Navy had known this from the day the first CVE was designed. The trade-off was accepted in Washington offices by officers who would not be on the ships when the trade-off came due. The trade-off came due 6 times on 6 oceans over 3 years. The men who paid it are still there. 25 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk in the war. 11 American aircraft carriers were sunk in the war. But the American shipbuilding effort produced in the same period more than 140 aircraft carriers of all classes. The Japanese produced fewer than 20 new ones after Pearl Harbor. That is, in the end, why the war in the Pacific ended the way it did. The United States did not win because its ships were better protected. It did not win because its torpedoes worked. It did not win because its commanders always made the right decisions. Its ships were sometimes badly designed. Its torpedoes often did not work. Its commanders sometimes made catastrophic errors. Halsey took his entire fast carrier force north on the night of October 24, 44, and left the entrance to Leyte Gulf undefended. Nimitz sent Yorktown to sea with civilian welders still on board, and Yorktown died 2 days later. The Bureau of Ordnance let the Mark 15 torpedo kill Americans for 20 months before it acted. The United States won because it could replace its dead ships faster than the Japanese could kill them. That is a hard sentence. It should be a hard sentence, because behind it are 3,000 American sailors on 11 ships in 3 oceans over 3 years and 8 months. Men who left small towns in Iowa and mill towns in Massachusetts, who left Waco, Texas, and Brooklyn, New York, and San Francisco, California. Men who trained at Great Lakes and at Pensacola, who wrote letters home from Pearl Harbor and from the Panama Canal, who told their mothers not to worry. Rear Admiral Henry Mullinix, Captain Irving Wiltsey, Mess Attendant Doris Miller, Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans, Lieutenant Milton Ricketts, who died on Yorktown at Coral Sea, the 233 men on Birmingham, who died because they came too close to Princeton, the 80 men on Hammond, who died because their depth charges went off around them in the water, the men of St. Lo, who died on the morning that organized suicide attack came to sea. Every one of them had a name. Every one of them had a family. Every one of them was, in the end, part of the arithmetic that answered the question at the top of this video. 11 American aircraft carriers were sunk during the Second World War. That is the number. It is not the whole answer. The whole answer is that the number was as small as it was because American industry outproduced its enemies at a scale that no nation in history had ever achieved before. And the number was as large as it was because American doctrine, American design, and American command-level decision-making failed repeatedly in ways that were foreseeable and, in some cases, foreseen. USS Enterprise, the ship that had stood alone in the Pacific on the night of October 26, 1942, survived the war. She earned 20 battle stars, more than any other American ship of the Second World War. She was decommissioned in February of 1947. Her crew and her veterans organizations campaigned for years to have her preserved as a museum ship. The campaign failed. In 1958, USS Enterprise, the ship the wartime banner had called Enterprise versus Japan, was sold to a scrapyard in Kearney, New Jersey. She was cut up for razor blades. Not one of the pre-war American fleet carriers of the original Lexington and Yorktown classes was preserved. The Yorktowns, the Lexingtons, the Hornets of 1941 and 1942 are all gone. Enterprise, the survivor, is gone with them. Some of the wartime Essex-class carriers were preserved, and you can walk their decks today. Intrepid in New York. Yorktown, the second Yorktown, built to replace the ship Yahachi Tanabe, killed at Midway in Charleston. Lexington, the second Lexington in Corpus Christi. Hornet, the second Hornet, built after the first, was sunk at Santa Cruz in Alameda. They carry the names of the dead. They were the answer to the dead. They are what a country builds when it has decided that it will not be beaten, and that it will pay whatever the cost of that decision turns out to be. The originals are still on the ocean floor. They have been there for a long time. 11 of them in the places where they died, with their crews still aboard them. They are the answer to the question. They are also, if we are honest about it, the price of the victory. Now, thank you for staying with this story to the end.